The Monkey's Paw, W. W. Jacobs. Part 1. Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlor of the Laburnum villa the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess, the former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who was having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiable desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check." "I should hardly think that he'd come tonight," said his father, with his hand poised over the board. "Mate," replied the son. "That's the worst of living so far out," bawled Mr. White with a sudden unlooked for violence. "Of all the beastly, slushy, out of the way places to live in, this is the worst. Pathways bog, and the roads torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only two houses in the road are let, they think it doesn't matter. Never mind, dear," said his wife soothingly. "Perhaps you'll win the next one." Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowingly glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he did a guilty grin in his thin gray beard. "There he is," said Herbert White, as the gate banged loudly and heavy footsteps came towards the door. The old man rose from hospital haste, and opening the door, was heard condoling with his new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said, "Hut, hut," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and recumbent of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing himself. The sergeant major shook hands and took his preferred seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host brought out drinks and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. They began to talk, the little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange peoples. 21 years of it," said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. "When he went away, he was a slip of the youth in the warehouse. Now look at him." "He don't look to have taken much harm," said Mrs. White politely. "I'd like to go to the India myself," said the old man, "just to look around a bit, you know." "Better where you are," said the sergeant major, shaking his head. "You put down the empty glasses," and sighing softly, shook it again. "I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers," said the old man. "What was it that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris?" "Nothing," said the soldier hastily. "Let's weigh nothing worth hearing." "Monkey's paw?" said Mrs. White curiously. "Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps," said the sergeant major offhandedly. His three listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. His host filled it for him. "To look at?" said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket. "It's just an old ordinary little paw dried to a mummy." He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Miss White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. "And what is there special about it?" inquired Mr. White, as he took it from his son, having examined it, placed it upon the table. "It has a spell put on it by an old fakir," said the sergeant major, "a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that three separate men could each have three wishes from it." His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat. "Well, why don't you have three, sir?" said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him in the way that middle age wont to regard presumptuous youth. "I have," he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. "And did you really have the three wishes granted?" asked Mrs. White. "I did," said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. "And has anybody else wished?" persisted the old lady. "The first man had his three wishes, yes," was the reply. "I don't know what the first two were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw." His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group. "If you had three wishes, it's no good to you now, then, Morris," said the old man at last. "What do you keep it for?" The soldier shook his head. "Fancy, I suppose," he said slowly. I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale, some of them, and those who do think anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterwards. If you could have another three wishes, said the old man, eyeing him keenly, would you have them? I don't know, said the other. I don't know. He took the paw and dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. Better let it burn, said the soldier solemnly. If you don't want it, Morris, said the other, give it to me. I won't, said his friend doggedly. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again like a sensible man. The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely. How do you do it? He inquired. Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud, said the sergeant major. But I warn you of the consequences. Sounds like the Arabian Nights, said Mrs. White as she rose and began to set the supper. Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me? Her husband, drew the talisman from his pocket, and then all three burst into laughter at the sergeant major with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. If you must wish, he said gruffly, wish for something sensible. Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket and placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten. Afterward, the three sat listening to an enthralled fashion to a second installment of the soldier's adventures in India. If a tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us, said Herbert, as the door closed behind their guest, just in time for him to catch the last train, we shan't make much of it. Did you give him anything for it, father? Inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely. A trifle, said he, coloring slightly. He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away. Likely, said Herbert, with pretended horror. Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with. Then you can't be henpecked. He darted around the table, pursued by a malignant Mrs. White armed with a antimacassar. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact, he said slowly. It seems to me I've got all I want. If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happier, wouldn't you? Said Herbert with his hand on his shoulder. Well, wish for £200 then. That will just do it. His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman as his son, with a solemn face somewhat marred by the wink at his mother, sat down the piano and struck a few impressive chords. I wish for £200, said the old man distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran towards him. It moved, he cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake. Well, I don't see the money, said his father as he picked it up and placed it on the table, and I bet I never shall. It must have been your fancy, father, said the wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head. Never mind, though. There's no harm done, but it gave me a shock at all the same. They sat down at the fire again. Outside the wind was higher than ever, and the old man stared nervously at the sound of the door banging upstairs. A silence unusual and depressing settled upon all three, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night. I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed, said Herbert as he bade them good night, and something horrible squatting up on top of the wardrobe, watching as you pocket your ill gotten gains. He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that, with a little uneasy laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed.